Okay, so I think we can start the last session of the day with, no, not the last, the last session made of two presentations. Yes, work package 5 and work package 6, but it's a session. There's no coffee break in between. Exactly. On work package 5 we have a presentation by Italo Colantone, friend and colleague at Bocconi.
Former student.
Very proud, yeah, I am a very proud instructor of him in the past. And as every good student is now much better than me, so I will leave him the floor. Thank you, Italo.
Carlo. That's very nice of you. I think the slides are not there yet, so I don't know if you can upload them. It's a PDF like Colantone, Bruegel. Okay, great. Okay, so thanks a lot for having me here and for the opportunity to be part of the project. So the paper I'm going to present is a joint work with Massimo Nelli and Piero Stanic. They are both co-authors at Bocconi University. So I'm the trade economist, Massimo Nelli is the labor economist, and Piero Stanic is the political scientist. So we are lucky enough to have already this paper published on the PNAS, so the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It's an outcome of which we are very happy about. Okay, so I know that you cannot see much in the slides, but basically I'm just giving you the overall motivation of the paper, which is reflecting my research agenda of the past few years, together with Piero and then with Massimo, that is trying to understand what are the factors that explain the recent political phenomena, and in particular the emergence of economic nationalist political forces. So two examples are always made, like Donald Trump winning in the US vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton, and Brexit. Britain First was one of the main slogans of the Leave campaigners. America First was the main slogan of Donald Trump in the first electoral campaign. Even more than that, if one looks at Western Europe, which is going to be the object of our analysis, there is a rising tendency, rising support for radical right parties already from the mid-80s onwards. Most recently this has become very evident, but it's something that was mounting already since decades. So what do we do here? So how can we explain these political phenomena? There is a very lively debate in academia between econ, political economy, political science on what are the factors that explain these political events. So support of radical right parties, globalization backlash, or more broadly the populist wave. And there are two types of explanations. So some authors are emphasizing a lot the cultural factors, like people are becoming more nativist, authoritarian, that's the reason why they're voting in a certain way. And there is also work on the economic determinants of this political realignment or backlash, call it as you want. The general idea in the economic part of the literature is that there is a sense of economic insecurity. That's the paper by Luigi Guiso, Tommaso Sonno, Massimo Morelli, and Helio Herrera. And feeling insecure, it's something that is pushing you towards, for example, radical right parties. So what we try to do in this business here, in this paper and in previous papers and in ongoing work, is to say something on the root economic causes of this phenomenon. So, okay, there is economic insecurity. What's behind this sense of economic insecurity? That's important to know, at least for two reasons. One is the intellectual curiosity of researchers. If we do this job, it's because we have the ambition to try to understand what's moving behind the surface of what is happening politically in society. But most importantly, it's a matter of policy implications also. So if we want to do something to improve on the current situation, well, we're supposed to have an idea which is as close as possible, as precise as possible, or what are the phenomena, the economic phenomena, the structural drivers of what we are observing. So we had a couple of papers together with Piero on globalization. So we were looking at the exposure to Chinese import competition, showing that places that have been suffering more from the globalization shocks, they ended up voting more in a nationalist radical right direction, or more for Brexit, for example. And what we do in this paper is instead looking at automation, so technological change, and what are the political implications of this. So the overall idea of this research agenda is that basically you have these structural changes in the economy. So globalization is one, technology is another one. Now we are working on the green transition. So these are all phenomena that produce aggregate welfare gains, but they have distributional consequences. So winners and losers across different geographic areas, across different social groups. And the fact that we have these losers may explain, why there is a backlash. And concerning the debate, it's the economy or it's cultural, some people really have strong feelings about it. So there are people who say it's the economy, full stop, it's not culture at all. Some people say the opposite, it's culture. We don't have strong feelings at all. So we have always tried to identify, hopefully in a credible way, the economic determinants, but we never really claimed that there's not a cultural component too. So there could be exogenous changes to culture that are orthogonal to what's happening in the economy. But also, I'm going to show you evidence of the fact that being exposed to economic shocks actually may trigger a change in attitudes, and that's actually a very important channel through which economic shocks may translate into different voting behavior. So what we do in this paper in particular, we look at 13 Western European countries between 1999 and 2015, and we basically focus on robot adoption in manufacturing. So it's good that I'm giving my talk after Verena and Stefan, because they've already explained everything about it. So we try to see whether being exposed in a different way to this shock of automation in manufacturing actually may change the way in which people are voting. So our analysis is really at the individual level, and we believe that the main methodological contribution of this paper is to provide, or to propose a method to evaluate the individual exposure to automation. Before, in an earlier version of the paper, we also had a district level analysis where we will show what happens from a political point of view in districts that are more or less exposed to automation, pretty much as Acemoglu and Restrepo did for the US. It's dropped from the final version of the paper because we were unlucky with the publication process. In the meantime, other papers have been published on that. So in the end, we emphasize mostly the individual level analysis, but we have consistent results unpublished also at the district level. Okay. Now, what we find is that stronger exposure to the automation shock leads to stronger support for radical right parties. And this is robust to controlling for other possible determinants of radical right voting. So globalization, exposure to the China shock, exposure to offshoring, and also cultural traits like traditionalism, nativism, or status threat. We also provide some evidence of the interplay. For example, we show that automation shock can be more consequential for voting behavior if you live in an area which has already suffered from the China shock. So the two shocks are kind of compounding each other. Whereas, as I was anticipating before, when it comes to cultural traits, we rather see that these are channels. So economic shocks may change attitudes and therefore lead to political results. If anything, there is some substitutability, right? For example, if you're already the type of person who is culturally close to radical right parties, the automation shock doesn't really change much for you. Whereas if you are the type of person who will not be close to radical right parties in virtue of your cultural characteristics, then the economic shock matters more. We also provide some evidence on the possible mechanisms at the individual level. So we show that ceteris paribus, if you are a worker who is very vulnerable to automation, you tend to have poorer economic conditions and well-being. You are less satisfied with the way the economy is run, with the government, and ultimately also with the democratic institutions. And that's a typical profile of somebody who then votes for a radical right party, at least in my opinion. So let me give you what's the main methodological contribution of the paper. Now, previous research will do the following. So you want to know how much certain worker, let's say Italo, is exposed to automation. What you do, you take an individual level survey, you know what's the occupation of Italo, then we know that different occupations are more or less exposed to automation, they are more or less automatable, which is what you were also discussing before. And they would say, okay, so Italo has a certain exposure to automation in virtue of the current occupation of Italo. The point is that my current occupation is already contaminated by automation dynamics. And I can give you a few examples. One intuitive example, which you can't read, but I'm going to explain it. So imagine I'm a worker in manufacturing, I have a very good job, stable job, and then I lose it because of automation. Let's say in year T minus 1. Then, you come to interview me in year T, and I'm working at McDonald's, right? Flipping burgers. If you look at my occupation in year T, you would say, this individual is not very much exposed to automation because that's not the type of job you're going to automate. It's not one of those good manufacturing jobs that are lost because of robots. However, I'm really the canonical loser of automation, right? But if you just use my current occupation, you don't really capture that. Even worse. So imagine I lose my job in year T minus 1, and in year T I'm unemployed. So there's no occupation that you can use to attribute to me an automation shock. So I'm simply out of your analysis, even though I will be the guy you want to have in your analysis, right? So this is what we call the direct displacement. So there are people that are directly displaced, and you wouldn't capture the fact that they are losers from automation if you just use the current occupation. But you can also go deeper. So there can be an indirect displacement story. So for example, I could be, sorry, it's here. I don't even read there. I could be, I'm myopic, but that's another story. So I could be a newcomer in the labor market. So my father used to be working at Fiat for 30 years with a very good job, very stable. I would like to have the same type of career trajectory, but these jobs are not there anymore because, these jobs are taken over by robots. This is what we can call indirect displacement. Or you could have a bunch of people who are not newcomers in the labor market, so they are already in the labor market, they have an occupation, but they perhaps would like to have a good, stable job in manufacturing, but these jobs are not there anymore because of automation. Okay. So for all these reasons, using the current occupation, in our opinion, is suboptimal in this respect. So what we propose is a way around it, and this is the main idea of what we do. So we don't use the current occupation. What we use is the following. So for each worker, we predict the probability of being employed in each two-digit occupation. Right? So we have a vector of predicted probabilities for each worker to be employed in each occupation. These probabilities are predicted based on what? So your age, your gender, education, region of residence, but using historical labor force survey data for your region. So what we try to understand is, in the pre-automation labor market, somebody like you, like 25 years old, without a college degree, living in Piedmont, was perhaps very likely to have an high automatable, an ex-post high automatable job, which is perhaps not there anymore available for you. So we try to build up a sort of counterfactual occupation for each individual based on the historical characteristics of the labor market to capture how far off you are from there. Then what's the individual vulnerability to automation? So we have a vector of predicted probabilities to be employed in each occupation. For each occupation, we have an automatability score. So basically, we just take a weighted average. Okay? That's your individual vulnerability to automation, but then the extra step is in individual exposure to automation. You may be very vulnerable in a context where automation is not going on, or you can be very vulnerable in a context in which a lot of automation is going on. So the exposure to automation is your vulnerability times how much automation is taking place in your country at a certain point in time. So you cannot read the formula, but basically we have the change in the stock of operational robots in a country, these are IFR data, multiplied times the vulnerability to automation. And this vulnerability is a weighted summation of theta j, which is the last term here, which is how automatable an occupation is, times what is your probability to be employed in that occupation, given your age, gender, education, region of residence, but this is an out-of-sample prediction from historical labor force survey data. So essentially, we take labor force survey from the beginning of the 90s. We have a multinomial logit prediction of the probability to be employed in each occupation. Then we take the parameter estimates, and we use these parameter estimates for out-of-sample predictions on more recent ESS data, European Social Survey data. Sorry, I have to rush. I would like to spend more time on it. But what's the main intuition is that, okay, given that we are in Belgium in 2015, and there is a certain wave of automation, so there is a certain growth in robots that are adopted in manufacturing, our measure wants to say, okay, you are more or less exposed to this phenomenon based on your individual vulnerability, which is essentially a combination of your individual characteristics and characteristics of the labor market, the historical labor market. So if you use this approach rather than using the current occupation, which is of course something we always do in a robustness check, right? And we can identify the two effects at the same time. But if you do this, you can then attribute a shock to people, which is not directly related to the occupations they are employed in right now. You can attribute a shock to workers who are unemployed right now. And also you can capture, for example, a high exposure to automation for young individuals was age, gender, individual profile and historical context would have made very likely to work for Fiat, right, in a high automatable job, but they are not there anymore because these jobs were available for their parents, but they are not available for them anymore. So that's the main idea. We try to capture really this counterfactual labor market dynamic at the individual level. Just to give you an idea, then of course, theta j is what? We have several options, but the main one, our favorite one, is the one by Frey and Osborne. It's a great paper, super cited, so for sure you know it. For each occupation, they tell you from 0 to 1 how likely you are to be automatable. So that's the main measure that we use. Delta R clearly could be endogenous, so we instrument it in 7 different ways. So that's the robot adoption in Belgium is instrumented using robot adoptions in other European countries, robot adoptions in the US, robot adoptions in Japan, New Zealand, other contexts, or a delta of indexes that are reflecting advances in computing. For example, number of transistors per microprocessor. So we try to instrument the delta R with technological dynamics, which are supposed to be exogenous with respect to local political dynamics. So I'm not sure that you can see it, but this is the distribution of individual vulnerability. And if you are highly educated, you tend to be less vulnerable than if you have a medium level of education or a low level of education, which makes sense. However, there is quite some overlap in the distribution, especially for low and middle income education groups, meaning that we're not just capturing an effect of education, to say. And also, if you look at different regions, you come up with the Acemoglu and Restrepo measure of how exposed you are to automation in virtue of your historical industry specialization. Well, you see that no matter if you look at low exposed region, medium exposed regions, high exposed regions, well, the distributions of individual vulnerability are pretty much overlapping. So the point is, which is something that Carlo was already hinting to before, this is a different thing than the China shock, right? So with the China shock, you really have entire industrial districts that go in a crisis. With automation, actually, if you are in a region which is automating a lot, you are in a very successful and dynamic region. The point is really, as an individual, who you are within this region. So are you the winner or are you the loser? That's kind of the things that we show. So, we look at election data, our main dependent variable, so it's European Social Survey. Our main dependent variable is whether you are supporting a radical right party or not, but we also look at other parties, radical left, or mainstream right. I can tell you that, ceteris paribus, if you are more exposed to automation as an individual, controlling for country year fixed effects, controlling for region fixed effects, basically you are more likely to support a radical right party. Okay? And also, but to a much lower extent, you are more likely to support a radical left party. But it's a much lower effect. If you ask me a question later, I will elaborate on this. Just suggesting possible questions for the discussion. That's a good strategy, I think. So, I've already said everything. What I can tell you is, in the last, 3 minutes, I think, I'm fine. I can tell you this, you cannot see it, but ceteris paribus, if you use the individual exposure to automation, you see that controlling for region fixed effects, country year fixed effects, age, gender, education. So if you're more exposed to automation, you are less likely to have a permanent contract, more likely to perceive your pay as inappropriate, your income as insufficient, your job as being less secure, you're going to be more at risk of unemployment, perceived risk of unemployment. You are less satisfied with life, with the economy, with the government, and even with democracy. Okay, so this is partly a validation of what you're doing, partly telling you something on the channels. So if you regress the same individual level variable over a regional shock, they are mostly insignificant. Meaning that if you are in Lombardy, in Italy, which is still a very dynamic region, on average, people are actually happier with the economy than they could be in Sicily, for instance. However, it depends who you are. So once you look at the individual exposure, then the automation shock kicks in. And I think this is one of the main messages of the paper. And I've anticipated already the other messages. Basically, we find that being exposed to automation changes your attitude. So you become more traditionalist, you become more authoritarian, you perceive a stronger status threat, and this could be one of the channels through which the political effect is then taking place. So the very bottom line of the paper is that there are very good economic reasons why people have been voting in the way they are voting. So we find this with globalization, we find this with automation. So dismissing the economic roots of these political phenomena, I think is very dangerous, and they are repeatedly dismissed. I think that's very dangerous because it would imply from the elite's point of view that nothing went wrong in the management of structural changes in the past decades, while there is a lot of evidence of the opposite. So the way in which people are voting has very good reasons. Whether this type of voting is going to solve their problems is a different business, right? So I don't believe that Donald Trump will be the president remembered for reducing inequalities in the United States, to be honest. So what's the policy challenge for the coming years is this of making structural changes politically sustainable by making these structural changes more inclusive. So we've seen globalization with automation, and green transition is the next step, I think, and that's another pretty similar phenomenon in terms of possible political implications. So thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you, Italo.
Thank you.
Perfect timing also. Thank you. So I give the floor to Estrella Gomez Herrera for the discussion. Okay.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Should I share the screen?
Yeah, sure. Do you have slides, Estrella?
Yeah, I have the slides. So
yeah, they are about to switch them. I see something is happening. There you are.
Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So first of all, yeah, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity of reading this paper. I think it's extremely interesting paper, actually. So, well, just to recap some of the ideas, I won't repeat everything because you've already listened, but this paper is essentially using the technological change as a structural factor, and then it shows that stronger exposure to automation leads to higher support for radical right parties. So the message is quite clear. It's quite clear from the very beginning of the paper also. So simple question, simple answer, very credible. And I think it's especially relevant because it's focusing on individual level data. So there are some studies at all the levels of aggregation, right? And the paper is, and Italo has explained this quite well also. The relevant difference becomes at the individual level. So that's why I think it's especially relevant paper. And then it's also joining or linking to topics which have not been so studied. I mean, there are a lot of studies on these separate topics, automation and voting, but the link were not so obvious. And I think this paper is doing a great job here. So yeah, highly relevant topic, impressively clean estimation. Actually, I should say that this discussion has been difficult because every concern that I had, it was already solved. So it has a lot of robustness checks and a lot of things that solve.
Rejections.
Yeah, I assume it has been hard. I saw you thank the 5 referees, so that should have been a hard process, but very fruitful, actually. It's very clean paper, and it's a pleasure to read it. So overall, I would summarize 4 main contributions that this paper makes, besides the content. But first is a key and timely topic, and it's empirical evidence, because there are a lot of opinion on these topics, but there are no empirical evidence. So this is quite an important contribution. Then the methodology is actually useful for other analysis as well, so it's quite versatile. And then the dataset, I actually entered into because I realized this could be useful for other ongoing projects I have, and the dataset is really ready to use, and the codes are really well structured and easy to understand. So that's an important contribution. And then importantly, it's also providing evidence in Europe, which is, I mean, there are some papers in US and many data on US, but for Europe, it is not so so well documented. So again, congratulations on this paper. And well, some ideas which are not actually concerns, because as I said, for instance, I thought about the IB. Of course, as every economist, I would jump into the IB, and then I realized you have all the 6 alternative IBs. So these are not concerns, but ideas that came into my mind when reading the paper. If I understood properly, your dependent variable is dummy for voting or not right party, extreme right. But then I thought there may be a lot of variation across countries for the 13 countries included in the sample with respect to the outside options, as you say. So it's probably depending a lot on the other parties that a given voter has available at the time of voting. So this could be interesting to explore. I mean, I think it's already controlled, probably in fixed effects, because they are time varying, but somehow this could be an interesting thing to see. And then also the income level of individuals. I don't know if this is possible or not, maybe it's impossible to join the automation risk with, to provide a quantitative measure of how much money this individual will be losing. That would be also relevant, because it's of course somehow affecting the perception that this individual has on his own loss. So this a quantitative and monetary measure of the income this specific individual may be losing. This could be interesting. Then to robustness that I thought about, maybe not even for, I mean, not for this paper, because this is already published and quite well published, but maybe if you are conducting similar analysis or you're planning to expand this, there's this nice paper by Song Tolan et al. So these are some people in the commission actually working on automation, and they provide a very interesting map on which are the skills. So not only the occupations at risk of automation, but also the skills. So how easy is to replace a specific skill that a worker has. So this is, I think this could be nicely contribute to your, as an alternative or even as a complement to your measure of automation risk. But this is quite detailed, and somehow I think it could be easy to merge. And then this alternative classification of political parties. I'm not in the policy, in the political literature, so I guess this is probably difficult. I thought about this when reading at the list for Spain, because actually for Spain, the specific party on the left, extreme left, is not that representative. And then for the extreme right, there's some boxes not included, which is one of the main. It is true that it started somehow at the end of the sample, but okay, I thought this could be also interesting, right? Because there are some, but I'm not into that literature, so I don't know if this could be useful or only messy. But anyways, and then another idea that came into my mind when reading the paper is, okay, it is quite interesting to see the dummy on people voting to the extreme right. But then it would be also enormously interesting to see how is the probability that a given individual change the vote, right? So this is probably a dummy with a profit on changing. If again, I don't know if this is possible with data, because I didn't explore in that much deep. But if there are the proportion of individuals, at least, that change the sign of the vote from extreme left, or at least from left to right or extreme right, this could be also enormously interesting, and a complementary analysis to what you have done. Otherwise, you can also include blacks to control for previous votes if this is available. So these are just some ideas that came to my mind when reading the paper, and then most of the things that I also thought about are related to future potential future ideas to explore. So okay, sorry, this slide I forgot. There's this which is also actually for future research, probably that automation, literature on automation is initially very much focused on manufacturing, but actually is now, or there is now, is much well documented in other sectors as well. And this could be enormously relevant for voting. So maybe this is of course the second paper, it's not the same paper, but this could be also tracking this over time with the new data on technological content of jobs, which is because the debate maybe is not only replacement of jobs, but also reskilling of workers. So I don't know, this could be a nice extension of this. Then there's a sentence in the paper that strongly struck my attention. Economic nationalism is not the right answer. Of course, I agree, but then for an empirical work, this could be a strong sentence, right? Because it's mostly based on, I mean, you saw automation increases the extreme right votes, but that's not necessarily harmful. I mean, in the strict terms, or at least voters of extreme right parties may agree that this is a good answer, right? So then a way to test this empirically, I thought, could be which are the consequences of extreme right parties on employment, actually. Because if you saw that, I mean, this is difficult because you need also these circumstances in history when your sample happening, extreme right party winning, and then this having a shock on employment. But if you could show that, quantity or quality, I mean, it's kind of showing that the expectation about the parties were not so useful. Trump can be a good example for this, maybe, or but this idea for me was something that shocked me, this sentence, which is provoking, and I think that's good. But also some empirical evidence here could help. And then potential future research. This is something that inspired me. So risk of automation, but also opportunities of automation. There are some papers now showing this job creation due to automation. So of course there are winners and there are losers, and you focus here on the losers. But what about the winners? Right? How is this changing the policy, the policy area, or the landscape for political parties? I mean, probably it's not so easy to measure because but actually it could be similar to what you've done. Because I also think it's very nice the way in which you measure individuals who could have gone into some occupations and didn't because they didn't have it. So this probability of being hired could work in both ways. So actually this could be a nice idea also for research. Of course, this I've already said actually the implications for skilling, and so this is not a paper on policy recommendations for education, but this could be actually, because you saw two interesting facts. First, how education affects employment probabilities, and this is very nice. And then second, how information on how the education translate into voting. So these two channels are quite interesting, and shows the need of a reskilling. We have evidence. There are several papers showing evidence on a talent shortage, actually. So there's a problem on automation, but there's also a problem on people not being able to adapt to the new skills required in the market. So this paper, I mean, this is completely different because it's not so much focused on political parties, this idea, but you have the data to do this, and this could be enormously interesting. This third idea here, you also have the data to do this. Individuals who actually lost the job during the sample you have, and how this is changing their votes. This could be also very much interesting because it's a different thing, right? The probability of being hired or the probability of being replaced with is different and complementary to the evidence of actually having lost the job. So I think this could also be an interesting idea for using the data you already have. And then, of course, more obvious ideas, which you have probably already thought about, extend this to other regions because it's extremely interesting. Then also use this analysis for regional analysis within countries, because many countries in the sample, in these 13 countries, may have problems with regional voting as well, not only national voting, but this could be extremely relevant. And finally, of course, this is also very much related to polarization in social networks. And there is this nice paper by Sophie and Mackler, which could be also useful here. So this is only as a potential extension if you want to explore these links. So that's all on my side. I think I'm on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Estrella, for a very nice discussion, a very extensive discussion, I think. Let me open the floor to questions. There are already 3 questions, so we can start with Maria.
Sorry, thank you, Carlo. Thank you also, Italo. That was absolutely, I mean, let me echo Estrella's praise. I think this is a very, very interesting paper, actually, and it has very interesting ramifications. Just a clarification to start with. You started the presentation by saying that there are 2 camps, one believing that there is the economic isolation or the economic disenfranchised, if I may call it this way, or the cultural factors. You didn't have strong views on which one it was. Am I correct in understanding that in your analysis, effectively you're saying via economic disadvantages, actually you end up having attitude changes? Is that a good way of interpreting your...
Yes, so
okay.
I mean, it's not a formal causal mediation analysis that we have here. So I was discussing before with Stefan, it's very difficult to do causal mediation analysis in this context because, the sequential ignorability assumption would be very problematic. But certainly, I think our results are telling you that economy matters. That's, I think, something that we learn. And, it interplays with culture. So cultural aspects may be changed by economic shocks. Yeah. There's evidence on that also with respect to globalization shocks in the literature. But I'm not excluding that culture may also vary independently from economic shocks. But certainly, I think that both are relevant. And I would say many people think that both are relevant. But still, in the literature, you have these very extreme views, like it's only culture, it's only economics.
Yeah, but then, and that brings me, of course, to the previous paper, because the previous paper is telling us that actually robots do not cause economic insecurity. Right?
Well, it's in our data. It seems that at least it causes perceived economic insecurity.
But there is a difference in the way that you measure it, because I think your left-hand side variable was employment, whereas your left-hand side variable is this exposure, right? My
right-hand side level will be the exposure, right?
The right-hand side, yeah, sorry,
okay.
That's right. Yeah, the right-hand side variable. You have this. The measurement is not employment. In the previous paper, it was really employment. Here, you have this exposure,
exactly.
Right?
And that. I think it's important to have it because current employment situation could be already endogenous to automation, right? I mean, if you're still able to work in a very automatable occupation after automation has taken place, you might be really the winner of this. So, okay, you're very much exposed, but you are the winner of this game, right? So maybe with fine-grained data, of course, it makes sense to I mean, I'm super fascinated by their paper, but if you're just working with European social survey data and it's also cross-sectional, I think that's the biggest approximation you can have. And then it's also a matter of perceptions that you have.
Wonderful, thank you.
Please. Sorry, Carla, didn't want to do your job, sorry.
We have Stefan and Erika.
Just a quick, if I understand it correctly, you take, among others, current education of people and predict what type of jobs would have been available to them 30 years ago, and you're also frequently making kind of comparisons saying, okay, look, if this kind of education, the parents of this individual would have been offered this and this job opportunities. I'm not sure that I buy this thought experiment because we have seen a huge educational upgrading over the last 30 or 40 years. So for Germany, we had 1/3 of the population going to college 20 years ago, and now it's 55%. There's a tremendous upgrading. So having the same education means that your relative position is much worse than that of your parents, right? So shouldn't we expect then also that your economic situation is much worse relative to your parents if you don't participate in the educational upgrading we have seen in the entire population?
Eric?
Yeah, just a short one on how to interpret the results. So let's say, I don't know, we went from 5% of the voting to the extreme right, and we went up somewhere around 22%, something like that. Now you've got all kinds of regional fixed effects, et cetera, et cetera. How much of that change is attributable to the technology? Because you have a significant result, but is it just tiny?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. I would like to ask the question that you anticipated, namely the extreme left and the reasoning why it's mostly extreme right. But since you've anticipated my question, I would like to anticipate your future paper, perhaps. Because for me, the most interesting would be to learn how actually we could revise the trend of support for the extreme right or left. I mean, so how we could increase the support for the center political spectrum or parties if, for example, we build a model around reaping all the benefits of the green transition, because you have a model which is like sort of nostalgic model built on the past. What if we did it, you know, from the future, build a model which is reaping full benefits of the green transition in Europe and see how it interacts with the political parties' support? Thank you.
So
okay, I think, Italo, you can answer the last three questions plus Estrella's point.
Estrella,
or
okay.
some of them, because
yeah,
there were very many interesting points.
There is many.
I give you 5 minutes. In total.
Okay, so I'll do my best. So first of all, Estrella, thank you so much, and you know, please, if you want to share the slides, I will be delighted. I've taken a lot of notes, but the slides will be even better. So let me say immediately that I share 100% of what you said. In particular, when you say, why don't we start trying to understand what are the policy-making consequences of radical right parties in power? I think today, if I can give a suggestion to a young PhD student, is okay, try to do this, you know, because I think this is going to be the next wave of papers. Now we have a lot of evidence on what explains support for parties, and this is yet another paper on that. But what are the implications once these parties get more power? I think that's definitely the next big thing to do. There is some evidence, but it's mostly historical for obvious reasons, because you know we are building up the evidence essentially on this. But that's very promising to me. Automation in services, you know, we had one robustness check when we look at robots in services too, but the data are not as good as for manufacturing. So that's really, you know, work that we did in order to translate these services data, which are more broad, into our analysis. Clearly, you know, if we would have a panel and we could look at switching for radical right parties, that would be great. And also with the panel, maybe you could have a look at who is actually displaced and who is not displaced. Although there is some literature like Aina Gallego and Thomas Kurer and also with coders, they are publishing papers on this. So for example, there is a paper, I think it's by Kurer, showing that if you are highly exposed to automation, okay, you may be more likely to support the radical right until you keep your job. Once your job is lost, then you want the left because it's pro-redistribution. So there might even be a difference at the point in time in which you're looking at these people. So definitely the panel dimension is very important. And the same people, so Aina Gallego, Thomas Kurer, I'm sure I'm forgetting coders, so I apologize with the coders from now. They also have a paper on, you know, what do the winners do, which is another very interesting question that you were asking. They do it in the UK context. So definitely one could update over time. I think Vox was not competing in the last elections we had for Spain, for example, and one can think about updating Frey and Osborne, thinking also about artificial intelligence. So that is certainly great. On the income level, you know, I wouldn't control in the regressions for the income level. For the same reason, I think it's problematic to control for attitudes. Because if we believe that your income will be post-treatment with respect to exposure to automation, then it would be essentially shutting down the channel or creating you know, a post-treatment bias in your estimates. But definitely, as an explorative analysis, one could try and see whether there are heterogeneous effects for different levels of income. Definitely that is an option. variation in outside options, clearly, as you fairly said already, we always have these country year fixed effects that are supposed to control for, you know, the electoral system in that year and all kinds of characteristics. But clearly, I mean, one can think about doing something, something else on that. And thank you for pointing out, this is something I wanted to say, but I didn't have the time to say, that our methodology is very flexible. So I mean, in the paper itself, we apply our methodology to understand what's your exposure to offshoring. So you have these predicted probabilities. Instead of multiplying them times the automatability of occupations, we multiply these times the offshoreability of occupation, like Blinder and Kruger index. So in principle, it's there, and it could be a very convenient way when you have, you know, cross-sectional data, essentially to try to have a counterfactual measure of exposure to a certain shock. It could be offshoring or anything else. Carlo, how many more minutes do I have? 2 minutes, okay. So Eastern EU independentism, I guess especially in Spain. So Spain, up until Vox, there was not really radical right party that I'm aware of, right? But one could argue that for example, the effects of the financial crisis was really instrumental for independentist claims in Catalonia, I guess. I mean, you are the Spanish, so I don't want to take on your role, but I guess you could say that. Then, you know, moving to the questions, the one by Erika can really answer on top of my mind. So one standard deviation, stronger exposure to automation makes you more likely to support radical right parties by 2.8 percentage points. And I think it's a substantive effects, right? Because the average vote share for radical right parties will be 4.8 in our sample. So we're talking about something that is, you know, not too big, not too small. I think it's reasonable what we have, especially combined with all this evidence on how you change your perceptions about how the economy and politics is run in your country. Stefan, that's absolutely an important point, right? So having a college degree in 2015 and having a college degree in 92 is two different things. I'm not sure where the bias will go, you know, in which direction it will go, right? Whether it work in our favor or not in our favor. We got some comments on this over the peer review process. For example, we excluded people born in 1980 onwards because their educational choices could be already endogenous to automation dynamics or, you know, forecasted automation dynamics, which is only tangential to what you were claiming, and we can, you know, develop this bias further. But definitely, your point is absolutely well taken. And on the very final comment, how can we solve the issue? So, you know, I think part of this may be self-correcting, right? So I mean, radical right parties in the beginning had an advantage because in most cases there were newcomers, let's say, in government, right? So it's easy to get a lot of support when you are a newcomer, you can blame everybody else, but then you have to prove yourself. And for example, you know, the radical right has been at the power in Italy for some time. It was not exactly a very exciting experience. Or Brexit. You know, many promises were made with Brexit. If you go now to the UK and you ask people who voted for Brexit, would you do it again? Do you think this has improved the situation? I'm not sure what kind of answers you could get. So part of it can be really, you have more policy responsibilities and then people can evaluate you. Then, you know, I think redistribution matters, right? So we are in Brussels. So if you think about the answer to the financial crisis and the answers to the COVID crisis, these are two completely different words, right? So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, for political entrepreneurs on the extreme right, and extreme left, it was very easy to mobilize people against the EU. Austerity, 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 that's not the way you treat people. With COVID, you know, okay, the crisis was different, right? But the political response has been completely different. Next generation EU. I mean, nowadays it's very difficult to blame the EU at this point because there's been a complete change. And I think this type of initiatives are perceived by the people. I mean, it's not that they go unnoticed. So, yeah, but so it must be a combination of political changes. Sorry, Carlo, the very last thing, the supply side may also change, right? So I mean, at the time, if you were a loser of globalization, a loser of automation, the Socialist Party, the Democratic Party will tell you globalization is good for everybody. This was the narrative up until Brexit, essentially, or Trump. And you will experience in your daily life that actually globalization was not good for you because your company was shutting down, jobs were lost, at least now there's been a change in narrative, and what we need is political forces that are able to combine, you know, the advantages of globalization, structural changes, without leaving people behind. I guess if we can have that supply side change in politics, this may also help.
No, thank you, Italo, and just as a caveat, Italo presented a paper a few days ago at Bocconi where similar effects are in place when you don't redistribute after a green transition. So the green transition is another, as you mentioned, another important element that we have to discuss. Okay, fascinating discussion, but we have to move on. Thank you. So we now move to the last work package, which capitalizes on all the micro findings that you have seen throughout the day to come up with some policy underpinning at the macro level. And we have a presentation by Nicola Vieggi on the low interest rates in Europe and the US, one trend and two stories. So if Nicola can come. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And the discussant is here.
Yeah, the discussant, Francesco, I saw him, yes.
Ah, here's Nicola, yeah.
Yeah. Nicola, there you are. We cannot hear you. Maybe you're... Let's see.
You need to mute only. You're muted.
Still muted.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Sorry for not being there with you. I really wish to have a conference in person. It's a long time. I'm presenting this paper we did with Maria. Now is more than 1 year ago. There is actually the question that we started with, sort of a policy paper that tried to argue and discuss around the observation of expected negative real interest rate both in Europe and US that the market expect for a very long time. Therefore, we were essentially, on one hand, analyzing what we will learn from the literature and try to explain why this long persistence on negative real interest rate, that from economic point of view is a significant departure from any model, any equilibrium model we can think about, and what this observation might tell about the future of the economy. When you think about real interest rate, as an economist, you think essentially at two things. One is the relation between saving and investment, and there is all the literature on secular stagnation that essentially try to find what are the forces that increase the supply of saving, reduce the demand of saving, therefore the reduction on investment, and this literature is very well known. And on the other hand, when you think about real interest rate, you really think about the firm. What is up, therefore, a sort of, if you want, the marginal productivity of capital. This one is where we tended to move, really thinking about what has been the effect of technological innovation and how the technological innovation, the evolution of market structure might at least explain and might somehow give some guidance of what are the origin of this long-term negative real interest rate, and also what could be the policy suggestion that come from analyzing this vast debate about the low interest rate. When we try to find an explanation of the low real interest rate, really we have to confront 4 facts when we think about the production function and what is happening with technological innovation. The 4 facts is essentially a no facts of a reduction in overall productivity, both in Euro area, US, Japan, that comes from a long time, that we haven't seen any change in the productivity trend with the new wave of technological innovation. Much to that, we have a reduction in labor share in all a lot of OECD countries, but actually even outside OECD. That essentially, if it's much a process of innovation, is not, is the substitution of labor with capital will be a normal process of substitution in a moment of innovation and change and in the process of growth. But this reduction in labor share is much with a reduction of fixed capital formation, therefore a sort of decline in fixed investment. That doesn't indicate a substitution between labor and capital, but indicate together with observation of an increase in the profit rate, give some indication of an increase in market concentration and a reduction in competition. That is in the literature very much linked to the change nature of investment, so the move away from investment in physical capital towards investment in intangible assets that have a characteristic compared to normal, to physical capital, that is more scalable and subjected, in most cases, subjected to legal protection that, together with globalization, increase, enable and increase the possibility of concentration, and therefore the observation in the new technological sector of the raising of superstar firms and of the discussion about the reduction in competition that we observe. The further along we are, countries are in the process of the digital transformation, technological change, especially all the discussion around Filippone, Guion, and there is a lot of literature in this sense, analyzing really how the rise of superstar firms has reduced the space of competition, also because these firms now have a large amount of rent that they can use to build up barriers to entry to new innovators, new competitors. And this one, especially in a situation like the United States, where competition rule, competition and legal framework are being weakened by the market and political power of the big new firm. Therefore, what the literature describe and what we focus is a sort of this a negative feedback loop between increase in between digital innovation that change the nature of the firm, change the nature of the investment and production process, that induce lower competition, because are sectors in which we can see much more increasing scale up, a faster scale up, much more winners takes all market, a globalization that even increase the return of firm concentration, and therefore high rent increase to entry, that increase the barriers to entry, then produce a reduction in low productivity, a reduction in productivity that put pressure down on real rate and and the return on capital, and then this negative feedback loop, because with low natural rates or with low real rates, what this produces is even lower competition, because now is even easier for the winners to finance the raising of barriers to entry. They reduce productivity, and therefore reduce also the successive wave of innovation. This element of how innovation and winners can introduce barriers to competition that reduce the next wave of innovation is actually not new in the process of technological innovation. This one was the reason for the building of anti-competitive laws after the first wave, the first industrial revolution. There was really a reaction against the excessive power of the first wind. And in some sense, we are in a similar situation in which how do we recreate a wave of innovation that reduce they increase the level of competition and therefore increase the return of investment and increase the level of growth. Therefore, in some sense, innovation, this kind of innovation, produce this kind of sort of low productivity, low really interest rate trap. How do we generate a new wave of innovation that breaks? And this one is very much what is the discussion. Therefore, innovation remain the solution of low growth, low productivity, and therefore the question is, what are the barriers that we need, and what are the policy barriers that we need to intervene to? Therefore, and here is where the story of US and Europe separates, because although this process is a global, and therefore what we see is a global reduction of the interest rate, the linkage to this to policy at the national level also matters in determining how we break this vicious cycle. And therefore, the discussion in US is a discussion about how we reduce the competition and how we reduce the concentration effect of this. In Europe, because it's a second mover, the question is how. Therefore, because there is a second mover disadvantage, the question then becomes what are the constraints for Europe to become a source of innovation? And in the process, the constraint could be a sort of a skill constraint, could be an issue of economic environment, and then we concentrate on finance. It's not a question of skill, therefore lack of innovators, because actually the skill characteristic of US, of Europe, is now that they are not different. What is different in the European context is much higher level of risk of investment. Therefore, what you have is a macroeconomic environment that is perceived as riskier, and that somehow inhibit investment, also because it is an investment that is subjected to this external pressure of anti-competitive pressure from outside. Therefore, although Europe is very advanced in terms of maintaining very competitive market, the global nature of this digital change push on Europe some of the effect of lack of competition from the rest of the world. And this one is partly seen by one of the things that is happening is that one way in which these global technological firms maintain their advantage is essentially to absorb young firms, especially European young firms. For this one is some observation about how many of the young firms, European young firms, are absorbed and bought by US firms compared to how many young US firms are absorbed by European firms. They show how much of the technological innovation that comes from Europe is absorbed in the process or is bought in by these big firms. Those reducing the possibility of contestation, of market contestation of these firms. And this one also because the nature of the financial market in Europe, that is much more bank-based, is not very conducive for investment on intangibles. Therefore, a bank-based financial system tend to discriminate against risk and against intangible investment. That reduces the possibility that that European innovator will find inside Europe the resources to compete internationally with the first mover in this space. Therefore, we focus in the discussion especially on this element, how the financial market, how the financial market and what are the financial instruments available to new firms limit in Europe the possibility of the creation of a new wave of innovative firms. And therefore, if we look at this process, then we are thinking that the low interest rate, the low real interest rate is going to stay because it's very structural of the kind of innovation and the kind of new economy that we are looking at. And in the US is an issue of rents and an environment that's becoming less and less competitive. In the EU is an issue of risk and an issue of finance. In this context, the issue of low real interest rate is more an issue of structure and less an issue of fiscal and monetary policy. What is then the solution? We have a discussion about what the discussion is now in Europe in a sort of do we introduce some sort of tire neighbor policies that is either raise barriers to entry protect the European market from external pressure, or finance looking for your own star to compete with global star. All the discussion in this about essentially that this one will even more reduce competition and reduce productivity, and therefore there is not a way out of this constraint. What we discuss in the paper is essentially two things. One is the role of Europe as a setter of competition rules, and some of the discussion against the big technological firms go in this direction of Europe thinking about what is his role as a set of competition rule internationally, and internally is about restructuring a sort of rules and finance and bank rules so that we increase an appetite for risk and an availability of a source of funding for the most innovative firm in the European context. This is a sort of a short summary on a large discussion, and obviously this one after two more shocks, the big shocks of the pandemic and the war, partly have changed the picture, but I think the fundamental structural issues remain a very interesting point of discussion.
Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a nice presentation. And let me give the floor to Francesco Papadia for the discussion.
Thank you very much. I hope the slides are on. Okay. Okay, so I've been thinking how I could contribute to discussing this interesting and broad paper. And the way I thought of doing it very well connects with the end of Nicola's presentation. That is how the changes that have taken place since this paper was written more than 1 year ago, do change the final result of this paper. That is that real interest rate will remain low going forward. I don't need to tell you what has changed because this is so dramatic that inflation, nominal interest rates, this is really a very deep changes, but it does not settle the issue of real rates. So I think it's useful to discuss this point. Now, I often find this Vixel Richter arbitrage diagram very useful to illustrate Vixel theory and more generally the functioning, well, not the functioning, I mean the very schematic function of an economy. Now, in this chart, in this diagram, the upper part is today, and the lower part is tomorrow. The right part is the monetary side of the economy, and the left side is the real side of the economy. And what basically this chart says is Vixel's story. If the interest rate on the monetary part is different from the real interest rate on the real economy side, on the left, then P2 is different from P1, and you have inflation. So this is as simple as and deep as it goes. So what Maria and Nicola are doing, they're not content with the very simple production function which is on the left of this chart, whereby 1 unit of wheat today transforms into 1 plus R wheat units of wheat tomorrow. So this is a paradoxically simple production function, and they want to explain what determines change, what else determines changes in R, the real rate of return, the equilibrium rate of return in the economy. And as I said, I mean, the basic question which I put, and to which Nicola has already given an indication of the answer that comes from that paper, is what will happen to R going forward? Will it remain as low, possibly negative, as it has been until recently? Now, if you go through the paper of Maria and Nicola, you find many possible causes of the low real rate of interest, which is interesting part of this paper, just because they go through the list and examine the list. I cannot follow them in this very analytical approach. What I can do, I can categorize their sources of low or possibly negative real interest rates. Here I've put my understanding of the list of factors that determine low real rates. And as I said, I cannot go through them one by one, but what I can notice is that all of them, nearly all of them, are structural factors which have a lot of inertia. You don't think that any, with one exception, any of these factors changes from one year to the other. The paper was written 1 year ago. Do these factors change in 15 months? Not really. I mean, the only one for which I have a doubt is globalization, because we know the story about reshoring and going deglobalization. But I think that this is, for the time being, is more a fear. We don't see it in statistics as yet. We read newspapers, we see what happens in the world. It's likely that we will have a pushback from globalization, but we don't know. So with the possible exception of globalization, all these factors are structural. All these factors don't change from one year to the other. In addition, and we just heard it from Nicola, I think rightly Maria and Nicola says, oh, listen, I mean, real rates of interest do not depend in a significant and persistent way on macro policies, do not depend on fiscal policy, do not depend on monetary policy. So conjunctural effects are not likely to have a strong effect on a persistent basis on real rates of interest. Now, what do we do with these two comments? Mostly structural factors. Macroeconomic policy do not impact real rates in a persistent. That real interest rate should remain low going forward. So from that point of view, the paper is still topical. All the reasons why real rates are low are still valid. And we have no particular reason to change our assessment. So my basic question, and as I said, I think Nicola already gave something of an answer, but Maria and him may want to expand on this further. Do you still believe in this conclusion? If you would write the paper now, having seen what has happened since you wrote it 15 months ago, would you want to change something? Would you want to change your conclusion? So this is my basic question. So then I have an ancillary question, and this is really drawn by a book that Charles Goodhart recently wrote about the great demographic reversal. And Charles' analysis is different in a number of respects from the analysis of Maria and Nicola. The conclusion he gets is different. He thinks that inflation will rise, nominal interest rate will rise, but they will rise more than inflation, so a real interest rate will rise in his analysis. And another difference is in the method. Basically, Charles' story is a global story. He doesn't expand on differences between one or the other part of the world, which instead is an essential part. I mean, the title of the paper is One Phenomenon, Two Stories. So that's another big difference. And yet, another difference is that Charles has one factor in mind, demographics. The demographic reversal is what will determine, in his analysis, the increase in inflation, the increase in nominal rates, and the increase in real rates. How does, the ancillary question is, how does your analysis match the global single factor analysis that leads to a different conclusion? Now, my last point is about policy implications. I mean, the paper is rich in terms of policy suggestion, but I think that two are the most important. One is increasing goods and services competition in the US, and the other is making the EU financial market more capable to manage risk and promote innovation. And completing capital market union would be very important in this respect. I could not agree more. These are two very important factors. My ancillary question is whether they would agree to add a third one, which is, of course, also derived from the analysis of Charles Goodhart, which is do something about demographics. We know that demographics in Europe is bad. In Italy, Spain, Germany is terribly bad. We know that this is not looked at with attention. I mean, you don't hear that this is a critical point, just because it's so long-term that maybe there is no government, leave alone the Italian government that lasts 11 months on average, but even the longer-term government that lasts for 5 years. Maybe this is beyond their horizon. I believe that something should be done on demographics, and of course the areas are clear: family support, helping women to have children and work at the same time by increasing social support, having youth-oriented policies. We know that it's a bit of a vicious circle. Fewer and fewer youth mean fewer and fewer young voters, meaning that older voters determine the policies, and they will choose policies that are good for them and not good for the young people. So my ancillary question, would you agree that on top of your two proposals, also doing something about the demographics development according to these three lines of action is essential? And I think that this was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Very nice points. Now, the question is Maria or Nicola answering Francesco? No, of course. We now turn to the floor.
I cannot hear people from the floor.
Okay, I will maybe...
But you will in a minute.
I can only... I could hear... Francesco, I could hear Francesco, therefore with the presenter mic I can hear, but I cannot hear people from the floor. Therefore Maria can answer the people from the floor, I think.
So any question? I have one, but I can start. No, please, go ahead.
Okay, so I was wondering why you didn't consider labor market, because you mentioned that the labor market share, it's a driver also for the low rates, real rates, and I was wondering why you didn't give it more, focus more attention, considering that the labor market in EU and US, it's so different, and it could be also explanatory, the dynamics, how the what is the replacement replacement rate of workers could also explain a bit. Also consider, following up on what Francesco's second question about how currently situation might look differently and how it can impact your analysis, I think that it's also worth to maybe follow up again, like on the labor market, because wage setting or like changes in current labor market, we saw again, like in US, low participation rate after COVID. And as far as I know, in EU, we don't have such a strong effect on the participation. So I think that maybe this could be also additional factor to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Niklas had a point, yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot. Very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you about asset price inflation. So we've seen this rise in the value or the importance of intangibles, but we also seen recently the rise of intangibles like NFTs, like cryptocurrencies, where they might not be so productive, but also they increase massively in terms of capitalization. So I was wondering, to which extent, or how do you think about disentangling, on the one hand, really the rise of them as a productive capital, whether it's on the hand just as a store of value?
Eric.
Kind of, in a way related, I've seen theoretical work tying in kind of the desire for safe assets and the inability of the European banking system to finance intangibles, leading to really a cycle where safe money goes into housing and you get the asset inflation. So that's something. But it's not something new. I've seen recent numbers on real rates imputed back to like 1620. And the surprising thing is that the real rates have been on a downward trend for 300 years. Now, that's not, maybe it is intangibles and we just didn't know how to describe what was going on. But is it really something that has to do with the idea that safe capital, in a very Marxian view, is just stored up labor and its rate of return is going to just keep on going down while we understand how it works, what's going on. It's just, you can create very complex financial markets and collateralized markets to indeed bring the safe return way down. And so is this really something new, or is it, it's kind of what I'm wondering. Do we need a separate analysis for this?
And maybe...
Okay, and Pavel?
Yeah. And Maria, if you allow me, also have one question.
Just one comment to Francesco's indication of demography as a key factor that should be also perhaps addressed, and your idea about more social support. I just wanted to say that based on the Polish experience in the recent years, we had a massive investment in the social policy aimed at raising demographics, and it didn't work at all. Actually, the trend has been stagnating. So the question is whether perhaps, because this is indeed, demography is a fundamental issue, whether perhaps we need some sort of a shock, like, war in Ukraine brought millions of workers to Poland and elsewhere, or maybe we should consider enlargement. Would it help? But I don't know.
And one final point related to Eric's question and what Nicola said at the beginning. I mean, that situation now has dramatically changed with all these shocks. But if you look at the forward real rate predicted by the markets in 2 to 3 years, it's not higher than 0.5% in terms of real rate. So nothing seems to have changed in terms of projected real rates, notwithstanding all the volatility and turbulence that we are witnessing. So probably the structural consequences that are lowering the rates on a very, very long trend are there. But the question that I have is, given where we ended up in terms of the investment needs and the accumulation of debt after the COVID crisis, is this relatively low rate optimal, or increasing it, wouldn't it have consequences in terms of financial sustainability after all? Because the optimal rate before COVID cannot be the same of the optimal rate after COVID from a financial point of view, at least in the medium term.
Okay. Nicola, did you hear the questions, or?
Yes, I did actually. I did.
I have faith in technology, Nicola, right? So, but may I make a couple of interventions, and then you can pick up some other comments.
Perfect.
So a lot of very interesting things that came out. First of all, on the crypto, I think the crypto market is still quite small in order to be of sort of global significance. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on what is going to the crypto. I personally think this is a bubble, and we have consumer implications, but that's a different thing in terms of affecting global interest rates. So I think the market is still quite small. On questions on the issue of demographics, first of all, thank you very much, Francesco, for your comments. And the demographic is a very important, as you said, Powell, actually structural, that needs to be addressed. The one thing I would add to the suite of policies you've given us, Francesco, is actually immigration as a policy tool to try and sort of solve some of the dynamics, because it is absolutely essential not only for the future of interest rates, but also the sustainability of public finances. I mean, this is a very big issue. Then a comment that I think goes to the sort of Rosa answering both what Eric said and Carlo in terms of the long-term interest rates, and can it be that the equilibrium interest rate in the future the same as pre-COVID? So I would say a couple of things here, and I don't know how much is of an answer, but I have the following thoughts. Eric's point that the trend has been really a very long term. I mean, 300 years isn't just, it is true, there is actually Dutch data that goes back to 1,000 years, you must have seen this, and it's actually, you can see there is a secular downward trend. So as part of it, I think, has to do with the way that we understand risk and manage risk. So, as the technology improves in managing the risk, think of kind of moving forward as improvements in securitization. As you reduce the risk, you are going to reduce that. Now, the point that I find is troubling in this is the fact that the trend means that the equilibrium real interest rate is actually negative. And I have troubles understanding what that means. How can an equilibrium price in real terms, which is actually clearing all the market, is actually negative? Yeah, I mean, I think this is the real, in fact, in some ways, Nicola, we started from that point, right? I mean, we say, so what does it mean to have an equilibrium price that is going to clear the markets that is actually negative? Right? Well, I mean, is that what it is? Is that the safe? Well, I mean, so that's, but that means, and that comes now to the question that I think I'd like to offer as answer to Carlo, that the lower the interest rate, the smaller the signal in terms of pricing for capital. So it's, I mean, if you have a very small price, and even negative because you actually pay for it, then it's very difficult to use the price as a signal to decipher between different investments. And this is a problem. You have to have other indicators to choose between different investments simply because the price won't do it, right? The signaling part of pricing when interest rates are so low is basically evaporating. And that is problematic. We need to find other ways characterizing what is a risky investment and what isn't, because the price won't do it with such low levels. And that is actually, in a world where you buy insurance between capitals, how do you choose what is a risky investment and what isn't? Right? I mean, you're paying in to buy this investment. This is actually problematic in terms of functioning of markets, which I think from a macroeconomic perspective is important. And in fact, it comes back to the sort of what we went out some full circle in this, and I think here Francesco was very clear on this. Nothing's changed. If you think about nothing's changed with the inflationary shock. Why is that? Because the equilibrium interest rate in nominal terms is about 2%. In the US, they're expecting, markets are expecting in the US 9 increases in the interest rate of 50 basis points, which is going to take the interest rate, the nominal interest rate, at 2.5. The inflation rate is 9. So the real rates are very, very negative. And of course, the same is for Europe, even worse, because we are, well, depending on the real, maybe not worse, because the inflation is also smaller. But if you're expecting sort of an equilibrium rate at 2, in nominal terms, over 6%, which is the latest inflation forecast, is still a -4. So nothing's really changed. The factors are really structural. And the case is, what if you wanted to advise to do something, monetary policy and fiscal policy won't do it because they operate on the nominal side. It is really the structural things. And then the question is, how would you order the policies that you could do? And I mean, I totally agree with Francesco that the one difference, and that comes also to Monica's point about the labor markets. I mean, it's an interesting thought, actually. We haven't thought about the labor market story here, so thank you for pointing this out. But The one thing that is a very big difference between the US and, and Europe, and actually Nicola showed this graph, is what they call the risk premium. And that is persistently in the US is 4 basis points, interest rate for 400 basis points, persistently lower in the US. So the EU, all the markets, I mean, here you have country markets, Germany being the safest, it will be still a lot less safe to invest. And that question is what? I mean, how do you increase that? And partly, in my view, part of that is finance. We don't have the right finance to undertake risky investments, which of course means that the green transition and indeed the digital transition will lack capital. We don't have the right capital to finance these transitions, in which case, you know, we need to, I mean, that the CMU agenda is one of great urgency in this respect. Yeah, I don't know. I think I've. I don't know if Nicola, you have anything to add there.
No, not much. Almost have it. Just thank you very much for the comment and discussion. Only one thing on the demographic. I think I find the work of Goodart fascinating. Being here, being in Africa. I wonder if the mechanism that he's looking at is actually much longer than he predicted. Therefore, there is still a lot of, if you want, labor force that need to be integrated in the global process that at the moment they are not, and especially here in Africa. What you will see now is a lot of Chinese investment coming in Africa to exploit now in relation to the Chinese labor force the reduction in salary and the reduction in salary that you can have. They have done it for Vietnam, for Bangladesh, etc. Therefore, this process that was underlying the Goodart, I think, is still this downward pressure on real rate coming from the globalization. Even in that context, I think is going to last for long. Therefore, yeah, but it's definitely another possibility. I agree actually that this pressure, downward pressure on rates, is reinforced after the pandemic because of the weakness of the financial system in relation to an increase of the rates. Therefore, the possibility of this wedge between inflation and nominal rate to remain high just to try to absorb the excess debt that is in the system, both in public and in the private sector, I think this one will remain a pressure. But this one go on top of the process that we described. Therefore, is almost a reinforcing that process, because then if you have negative real rate, the problem of zombie firms, the problem of reduction in productivity is even more reinforced. That and therefore policy instead for the increase in productivity, for the increase of innovation, for increasing competition become even more important. And this one gets me to the last thing, that is the issue of demography, and the fact, yes, that there is, I think that is fundamental. There is an opportunity there because Europe has got the youngest continent in the world very close. The tie between Europe and Africa are very strong historically, although not always positive. And I feel the possibility of using migration and using young skills and transferring skills and using migration as a productivity and growth process, I think that one is ideally, as an economist, optimal. Politically, it's always complex to pass, as we have seen actually in a lot of the presentation. But this one is just my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I think we can close. Francesco, go.
Shortly, 3 points. Crypto, small, getting smaller, not quite at optimal level, which is 0. But I think that
it's a central banker
that deals with it. Now, migration, most seriously, migration. I'm all in favor of migration. But I think Nicola said there are clearly political limits. I mean, look what has happened to Madame Merkel when we said, wir schaffen das. Wir schaffen das up to a point. I mean, she nearly lost power because of wir schaffen das. And of course, we see Ukraine. Oh, yeah, 1 million Syrians, no. 4 million Ukrainian, yes. This shows that there are social limits to migration. So yes, migration is important, should be managed, is a part of the answer, is not the total answer. I think we have to produce more children. And the third small point about family support measures work or don't work. Well, I think maybe on a time series basis they don't work, but on a cross-country basis they do work. Scandinavian women make children. French women make children. Italian women don't make children. Spanish women don't make children. And if you look at support for families, you see that in Scandinavia you get a lot of services. In France you get money. In Germany, Italy, and Spain, you get little money and little support. And so I think that maybe these measures work over the long run. So you only find the effects in cross-country evidence, not in time series evidence. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. My maybe final thought, unless we have now in final Q&A session, so we can just speculate a bit if for a few minutes, is, Maria, what you were saying is that I fully agree with this fact that if the situation is like that, and what also Nicola added, that there is this pressure to keep real rates low because of the accumulation of debt, then we are looking at a model in which there has to be a lot of directionality by central authorities in which investments are worth taking and which are not worth taking, in where you have a sort of a political guarantee of a return versus not of a return. And if you think about it, the entire experience of the national recovery plans is not very far away from this, because they are clearly telling you where you should invest and what sort of course, I'm generalizing, but there is a much stronger sense of intervention by central authorities and let's say the political system, in absence of signals that come from the market in a way. So probably, I mean, this is a very broad issue that we can maybe talk for ages, but this is something that saying this in Brussels is probably something worth mentioning, no?
And to that I would add, and that comes back to Francesco's point, that it's not the debt finance that we need to go forward, because there's so much pressure on the piles of debt, both on the fiscal and on the private side. It has to come through equity. So if there are any investments that are worth money, because even if you do have directionality coming from sort of the big interventions on the green transition and the digital transition, you cannot do it without private money. You have to lever up. And lever up is a bad word here, because I think you have to equate up. And that is, of course, the one thing we do lack in Europe, which, of course, is going to keep us back. Debts cannot match the public funds. It has to be something else. And what is that something else when you have very little appetite for risk-taking in Europe as a result of taste, but also the way that we organize the financial system. That's why we think this is a first-order urgency problem in Europe, not a second-order.
Yeah.
Can I continue on the issue of migration, because I think it's particularly important to all of our problems, perhaps. And I totally agree that migration is a bomb. I mean, politically speaking, we've had Brexit, we have Trump, Le Pen, so absolutely it's a killer. But on the other hand, as Francesco said, 1 million Syrians is now, but 4 million Ukrainians is yes. And you know, there is a question what it means for us, because maybe there is some sort of a change in a social mood. Because, for example, you know, again, I'm talking about Poland. You know, Polish government have refused constantly to receive 100 Syrians. And yet, when the war erupted, there are like millions of Ukrainians coming, and the government is in favor, the society is in favor. Of course, it's going to have ramifications because they are in favor now. It's going to, you know, produce some structural problems along the line. But I'm just saying that perhaps we have to look differently for a perspective of migration from Africa, which is probably perceived differently in some parts of Europe, and differently and we should perhaps perceive differently the potential of migration from I don't know, Western Balkans, countries like Ukraine, which are, okay, maybe it's not politically correct, but you know, they are somehow culturally, socially differently perceived. And I know that there's this whole discussion that we are hypocrites because we don't want to take the Syrians, but we want to take the Ukrainians. But you know, this is a matter of this is a matter of fact. I mean, that's happened. That's what our societies somehow accept. So maybe indeed there is a big potential there. I don't know. Just a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're edging towards enlargement, which I think is going to be, because I mean, yeah.
If I can.
Yeah, Nicola.
Is not necessarily solving the problem Europe has, because East Europe is as old as West Europe. Therefore, it doesn't solve the demographic problem. It doesn't solve the need sort of innovation and young generation. Therefore, I agree with Francesco. It's pretty obvious that there is policies, family policies, etc., that incentivize the new natality rates. That is about the role of the family and how the state support women, essentially. And but we also have to think about what is the role of migration. Not all really in the process of innovation. We had before the paper of Valerie, I think it was, you know, is the kind of indication of what migration can give, especially when it's focused on high skill and on attracting sort of the high level, the high skill. And Europe has got, you know, the education system has got an infrastructure, etc., that actually can be very attractive. But we are not really competing with the migration, the skill migration that go, for example, US, etc. Therefore, that one is about our university system, is about our education system, is about even how attractive is Europe to researchers from all over the world. For that kind of migration is entered directly in the production function that we describe in the paper.
Okay, I think we can close the session and leave to Maria the final words for today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Nicola. Thanks for joining us from Pretoria. And with this, put a close to the first day. Thank you all for a very, very fascinating group of papers, actually quite diverse in their structures and in their messaging. Tomorrow we meet again at 10. Oh, sorry, we have it here. At 10 we meet, no, at 10 not, we don't meet, 10? But we don't have a meeting in the morning?
10 we have the youth conference and we have the working...
That's right, we have a meeting, yes, in the morning.
We have our meeting and then we have the policy conference starting for lunch.
And the policy conference starts at 2, but we have lunch which starts at 12:30, so we see you then. And tonight, don't forget to join us at dinner. Manuela, do you want to tell us where to go and what time?
Yes, it's at Richter nearby St. Catherine. So the only operator metro line goes there. So number 1. Yeah.
Oh, so there is a metro. Okay.
Yes, it's the only one from Arlois directly to St. Catherine, and then it's 3-minute walking distance. So we can meet there at 7:30.
At 7 o'clock. Okay, wonderful. Any other questions, Eric? Yeah.
Yeah, I saw on the program this was the final Q&A, so I actually have a question. Maybe we can discuss it over dinner. When we were writing the proposal for this MICROPROD, there was some tension among the team between whether we were in a period of secular productivity growth declines or whether we were just about to have a turnaround and a productivity boom. And I actually don't see any of our research answering that question. So if people want to think about that tonight, are we any closer to the turnaround where the new technology and the things we have are actually going to be used for benefit of society and increase at an increasing rate the improvements in well-being per capita? So it's kind of a question to mull over, and then maybe the second question is, well, how do we go and find evidence for that?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. Wonderful question. Yeah. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at 7 o'clock at the restaurant. Thank you. Nicola, thanks very much. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao. Bye.